Extending the campaign further would, of course, mean that next season is seriously delayed, Rob. And there's little room, I think, for manoeuvre, especially, of course, if there's a spate of positive tests at club, which could derail all of these plans.
Yes, training to resume under social distancing protocols then, but some players aren't happy with that, are they? And what's more, they're being asked to sign waivers. What's the likelihood of serious dispute over this?
Well, Premier League bosses, I think, will draw confidence from the fact that the Bundesliga in Germany resumed over the weekend, and that will reassure many players too. But there are still tensions. Raheem Sterling, for example, has said that a full 4 to 5 weeks of full training is needed before matches start. Other players have also expressed concerns about returning. When it comes to these liability waivers and consent forms that players are being asked to sign, there's perhaps more likely to be concern, I think, when the next phase of contact training starts. But as it stands, there doesn't seem to be a large-scale rebellion by players brewing at this time.
So they're inching forward towards a resumption of the Premier League season, but the smaller clubs of the Football League, well, they're facing a new reality now, aren't they?
They are. With many clubs in League One, of course, were unable to afford the costs of testing players, and they're being denied crucial match-day revenue, of course, even when the season resumes behind closed doors. So the regular season is still likely to be cancelled. As with League Two, who voted to do that last week, a points-per-game system would be used to decide the final table. But with 6 clubs in with a chance of promotion, all wanting to continue, it could well be that an expanded playoffs involving as many as 8 clubs rather than 4 is under consideration. The EFL, of course, must ratify all of these decisions. But the longer-term fear, Rob, is that the 48 clubs that make up Leagues 1 and 2 next season will not play again until crowds are allowed back inside grounds, and no one knows, of course, when that will be. It's easy to see, therefore, I think, why there are these mounting calls now, not least from government, for the Premier League, which is thought to have cash reserves of £1.5 billion to help support the rest of the footballing family, especially if its season does resume.
OK, Dan Rowan, sports editor, thanks very much. You mentioned the German Bundesliga season and its resumption. We'll have much more on this in an hour from now.
Thanks, Rob. Let's find out where the Poet Laureate goes every Saturday night.
Welcome to the shed.
Nice shed.
Welcome Kate Tempest. Maxine Peake. Welcome Testament.
Yo, hello.
Join me, Simon Armitage, and a weekly guest from the sanctuary at the bottom of my garden.
I never thought that being in Elbow would one day involve auditioning old men.
Just wait a few years. Conversations about music, life and language.
Basically said to us, don't go anywhere near Shakespeare. Don't go anywhere near Shakespeare. It's not for you guys.
The Poet Laureate has gone to his shed. New for Saturday nights at 7:15 on BBC Radio 4 and on BBC Sounds.
To the weather, a few showers in the west and the north, but generally it is going to be sunnier and it is going to be warmer too.
You're listening to Today on Radio 4 with Justin Webb and Nick Robinson. At 25 to 8, Chris Aldridge has a summary of the news.
A number of measures are in place this morning to help more people travel back to work safely by train. Security guards specialising in crowd control are on duty in major railway stations. More trains are being laid on, but with restrictions to the numbers allowed to board. MPs are to debate the government's post-Brexit immigration system. Under the proposed rules, people regarded by ministers as low-skilled will be barred from working in the UK. That would exclude some occupations which have been on the front line during the coronavirus outbreak, such as care workers. Northern Ireland is taking some steps towards easing its lockdown today, with garden centres and recycling facilities reopening. The Health Minister at Stormont has also announced that all care home staff and residents will be offered coronavirus tests. In the Irish Republic, small groups of people will be able to meet outdoors. Some residents of Brazil's most populous city have been accused of playing Russian roulette with other people's lives by refusing to observe social distancing rules. Sao Paulo's mayor has warned them that the health system is close to collapse, with public hospitals in the city now 90% full. The World Health Organization will face calls for an independent investigation into the pandemic at its annual assembly, which opens today in a virtual format. The WHO's own response to the crisis is likely to be criticized. A survey by the Institute for Fiscal Studies suggests that children from wealthier families are spending 30% more time each day studying in lockdown than more disadvantaged pupils. Less well-off children were said to be less likely to have a place to study. Ryanair has reported profits of around £900 million for the year to the end of March, an increase of 13%. However, the airline has warned of a difficult year ahead. It's already announced it's cutting 3,000 jobs.
Thanks, Chris. It's coming up to 23 minutes to 8. On many packed commuter trains, you'd be lucky if you can keep 2 inches away from your fellow traveller, let alone 2 metres. So with more people returning to work on trains that have many fewer seats, how are passengers going to be able to keep their distance? This is the first day on which services have been increased since people in England were urged to return to work if they can't work from home. In a moment, we'll hear from the man tasked by the government to keep passengers safe. First, our correspondent, transport correspondent Tom Burridge is at Euston. Has it got any busier since we last talked to you, Tom?
Not really, Nick. I mean, I can see sort of dozens of passengers streaming through the concourse now from a particular platform, but, you know, compared to normal, this is very, very quiet in London Euston this morning. That's what rail companies want. That's what they're working for, and that's what the advice is designed to create. And it's probably at points this morning more staff than passengers. There's lots of British Transport Police, lots of security staff to manage flows of passengers if necessary. And dotted around the station, there are yellow metal gates which they can pull across entrances and exits and entrances to platforms if necessary, if they judge that there are too many people. And I'm told that the forecasting for train companies really says that passenger numbers are expected to rise significantly several weeks from now, and that's why they're considering other measures at stations, like possibly requiring people to book an arrival slot time at their local station in the future so that there aren't crowds.
Tom Burridge, thank you very much indeed. Sir Peter Hendy chairs Network Rail. He used to be Commissioner of Transport for London, and he was asked last week by the Transport Secretary to oversee the process of keeping passengers safe. Morning to you, Sir Peter.
Morning.
With all the measures we've been hearing about, the others you've been taking, what do you think is the maximum number of passengers compared with normal times that the railways can safely take?
Well, it's no more than 10 to 15%, I'm afraid. Because of the capacity of trains, the need not to be near each other. It's the reverse of what we've all been trying to achieve in our careers in public transport. But it is necessary for this terrible time.
So even with all the measures, everything, and all the learning, which presumably you'll do today and the next few days to come, you'll still only want to go to, what, 10 or 15%?
Yeah, because 2 metres is the advice from the scientists, and of course we should all take it. Today's train service is a bit more than it was last week. It's up to a bit under 70% of normal, and in the coming weeks I'm sure there'll be more. But so long as the 2 metres applies, and we will of course follow that as we should do, then the real capacity of public transport is going to be very limited.
We heard there from our transport correspondent, a lot of staff there, gates if they need to cut the numbers going onto platforms down. Is this really going to be driven by policing, or will we have to self-police? Will passengers in the end have to make judgments about how big the crowd should be and whether they should squash onto a train?
So it starts well before that. So the whole campaign about public information about not travelling unless you must is designed to reduce the load before people get anywhere near stations. And there's been a huge public information campaign after the government's announcement on Tuesday. Millions of emails from Transport for London and the train operators, their customers, a massive amount of work with employers, because after all you wouldn't set out for work if your employer asked you not to come. Transport for London alone spoke to 300 employers last week, and Baroness Veer at the department had a meeting with all the big employers organisations on Friday, so that well before you get to the station you should know whether or not you should be there. So that's the first thing. When you get to the station, a huge amount of work has gone in by the rail operators, and that's what I was asked to look at in terms of setting out stations to make sure we can cope with the numbers of people that we're expecting and do it safely. So one-way systems, lots of signage. I'm really pleased to hear from Tom that there are loads and loads of extra staff at Euston this morning, and that's replicated right around the network with more staff and more British Transport Police. Because
Can
actually
you really see an end to the rush hour, though, because there's a reason we all work at the same time, is because, you know, we need to coordinate our lives with picking up children from school or the time that our partners may be going into work. It is quite difficult. We all commute at totally different times for other reasons, isn't it?
Well, look, I mean, it is difficult. This is an unprecedented situation in all our lives, and I think to cope with it, we have to be reasonable and rational. And our passengers are reasonable and rational. I think people understand. They don't want to be too close to people. I certainly don't. We've asked people to maintain 2 metres distance where possible and use a face covering if you can, so that you're less likely to infect other people. I mean,
if you can, Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if you can, you said of the face mask there, and we just heard from the boss of Ryanair his contention that the only safe way of travelling on public transport is his opinion, but he claimed that there was research to back him up, that the only safe way was to wear a face covering or mask. Have you seen that evidence? And do you agree with the Mayor of London, who wants everybody to be told to wear face covering or mask?
Well, look, I'm a public transport operator, not a scientist or a doctor. I think my observation is, when I went round yesterday to look at the arrangements at stations, that there are a lot of people wearing face coverings, and I myself are wearing a face covering because it seems to me to be a sensible and practical thing to do. We're trying to run this system in the most extraordinary circumstances of not wanting people to be closer to each other than they have to, and my observation is that so far we saw an increase last week after the Prime Minister's announcement a week yesterday of about 8 or 9% extra people on trains. It tailed off towards the end of the week. I think people are being profoundly sensible, and providing that we do our best to look after them and they try as hard as they can to socially distance, I think we can make this as safe as we can.
Sir Peter Hendy, Chair of Network Rail, thanks for joining us.
Brings us to 17 minutes to 8, and time for a look at the papers, where the row between the government and the teaching unions over the planned reopening of schools in England is again analysed. Professor Alan Smithers from the University of Buckingham writes in the Daily Mail, "The future of this country's children is now hanging by a thread. The damage caused by the current closure could be beyond repair for a generation." The paper's editorial lays the blame for parents being scared to send their children back to school at the feet of the union and Labour as well. The Daily Mirror's Julie McCaffrey compares the standoff to a schoolyard game of British Bulldog, where there's bound to be casualties.
The Eye leads on claims that safety inspections of workplaces previously promised by the government won't now take place. It says the Health and Safety Executive has suspended all checks to protect its own staff, and that companies will be asked to self-police instead. The Guardian also touches on the subject, reporting that many companies may have bought personal protective equipment that doesn't meet British safety standards. It quotes the British Standards Institute, which says it's seen an increase in PPE being sold with false certification during the pandemic.
The Financial Times reports that the American blues musician Travis McCready is set to stage the first large socially distanced concert in the US since coronavirus lockdowns began, which could provide a template for how live music could resume around the world. He's aiming to play a show in Arkansas where the venue will be disinfected with fog sprayers before the gig. Those attending will need to wear masks and have their temperatures taken at the door. Audience members will also be kept 6 feet apart in the auditorium.
Will that be fun, you wonder? We've all become familiar with Nightingale hospitals in recent weeks, but the Mail features the tale of a 91-year-old woman from Norfolk who's created a so-called Knittingale hospital to raise money for the NHS. Margaret Seaman has knitted a replica of the makeshift facility at London's Excel Centre, complete with crocheted beds, I'm not making this up, health workers, patients, and even medical equipment like X-ray machines and drips. The great-great-grandmother is hoping to raise at least £5,000 to help 3 hospitals near her home in the village of Caister-on-Sea. Keep knitting.
The time, 7:45. It is the Chelsea Flower Show today, but not, of course, as you know it. All online, as so much of our life is. Does that work for gardens? Will it work for the show? Bunny Guinness is on the line, the landscape architect, 6 times gold winner at Chelsea. Morning to you.
Good morning, and what a beautiful morning it would have been if we had been there.
Oh, my goodness, yes, lovely in London, which is explained to people outside London who may still be seeing a bit of rain and all the rest. It is absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous weather. So, that bit of it is sad. What bit of it can be rescued?
Well, the Royal Horticultural Society are taking a leaf out of the National Garden Schemes book, because they've been putting virtual tours of people's gardens who would be opening to the public. And obviously the National Garden Scheme raised money for lots of medical charities, including Horatio's Garden. And today they're putting Tom Stewart Smith, who's obviously a very well-known gold-winning designer's garden, up on the NGS website, and they're putting my garden. Julie Toll's doing a garden. And the RHS are doing the same. They're going to Sarah Eberly's garden, who's done many gardens at Chelsea, and she's going to give people lockdown tips for gardening. And they're going to David Austin Roses, so you'll have a virtual trip around his nursery, seeing what roses they're breeding and which ones they would have launched today. Raymond Everson, the very famous Clematis Square, you'll have a look around his nurseries. So they are working hard, but they are also having all the BBC coverage, but they're just rehashing gardens over the last 10 years. So the normal BBC slots, I think, are on in the morning and the evening, but then during the day, the RHS are doing these other bits, with Monty doing a virtual tour around the bits of his garden.
So you can see the gardens, but you can't smell them.
You can't. I think the atmosphere is obviously very different, but we're getting used to that, isn't it? Everything is different this year. But I think it's a really good attempt to get everybody gardening, and more of us are, and more of us need more inspiration from these shows, I think, than ever before, don't we? Because we're all sort of tuning into it.
And the show itself was terribly tough on people who would have been, they would have been quite far into their plans for it, wouldn't they, the people who were going to be displaying?
Absolutely. If you're doing a garden, you will have started 12 months before at least. And I think it was just like 4 weeks before? Normally you start almost the beginning of April. So you'll have had most of the stands virtually done, the plants all grown. It's really difficult, and obviously it's a huge business, horticulture in the country, and Chelsea is a big sign for that, and it really boosts it. So that's a really another sort of
back again
thing.
Next year then.
Absolutely.
Bonnie Guinness, and you'll be there for sure. Thank you very much for talking to us this morning.
Pleasure.
Coming up to 11 minutes to 8, it's time for Thought for the Day. The speaker this morning is the Reverend Dr. Jane Leach, the principal of Wesley House, the Methodist College in Cambridge.
Good morning. It's Monday, and whether we're working or furloughed, on the front line or multitasking at home, many of us are beginning the week tired after another not-quite weekend. It seems our initial energies to find new routines and ways of coping with the challenges of this virus and its restrictions are running low, as it begins to dawn on us just how far away the horizon might be of a return to some kind of normal life, and just how many phases of adjustment there may be ahead of us. We are grieving things, large and small. We try to find meaning in it all, but exhaustion sets in. Hitting that wall myself last week, I stood up somewhat wearily to lead evening prayer on Thursday and found myself saying aloud the words from the prophet Isaiah, "They that wait for the Spirit shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." The image took me back 12 months to a walk along the Potomac River downstream from Washington, D.C., to the nest of a bald eagle. I found it because others were already looking at it, a nest the size of a bathtub with 2 huge chicks in it. We watched and waited, and eventually an improbably heavy bird tipped itself out of the nest, dipped below it, and then gradually began to climb. His clumsy fall into flight reminded me of a line from a poem of Rainer Maria Rilke's. Even a bird has to trust its own heaviness before it can fly. I was struck then by the trust that's needed in order to let go into flight for the first time, and now I'm struck by the trust that's needed to risk stopping trying to hold it all together. Can we trust that if we let go we won't simply fall? Can we risk being overwhelmed if we stop trying to keep the chaos at bay? Others have been this way before us. In the Hebrew thought of the Old Testament, chaos is often expressed in the language of inundation and flood. Overwhelming despair is expressed in the language of the abyss. In both images, God is the one who sets our feet on solid ground. A friend of mine who lost a child once reflected with me on the kind of ground that God offers when we fall. "It's not a feather bed," he said. "It's more like a concrete floor. There's little comfort in it, yet you can trust it to hold you." Most of us prefer to hold ourselves together. Holding it all together is something we want and need to be able to do most of the time, and yet we're far more likely to be able to if we can allow ourselves a break and trust that even if we let go, we will not fall. That if we can stop and wait and feel, our strength will be renewed.
That was Thought for the Day with the Reverend Jane Leach. It's now 9 minutes to 8.
What should our immigration system be once we've completely left the EU, and how much does the catastrophe that has gripped the world in recent weeks affect that system, potentially change our plans for it? The Commons today debates the government's plans for immigration. Those plans would stop workers described as low skilled from coming here. Of course, quite a few of the people we are depending on at the moment in hospitals and other places come into that category. There is also the question of the health surcharge that immigrants have to pay, which is due to rise very sharply. We'll talk in a minute to Labour's spokesman, but first to Dr. Chandra Kanaganti, who is chair of the British International Doctors Association and is a Conservative councillor. Morning to you.
Good morning, Nick.
Well, it's just now. So when you look at overall at the government's plans, what should stay the same and what should change?
I think the system should be firmer, fair and simple. What we need is people who come to this country as migrants to drive our economy forward and to have a foundation for a high productivity economy and who contribute to our society. I suspect that the new immigration system looks at a point system, which is very successful in Australia, to get those kind of skilled people we need. And this also should make it easier and quicker for medical professionals around the world to work in the NHS. There's a new fast-track NHS visa that will help the system.
What about those people who are not described as highly skilled, but who certainly have skills and upon whom we often depend and who are often badly paid? And I'm thinking particularly of people, for instance, people from the Philippines who work in care homes, categories like that. Do you think the government needs to think again about its attitude to them?
If you look at the guidance, there's something called where we need people, like what you just explained, the care industry. There is an element that there is a new way of identifying those people and protecting these category. For example, for the visa, the point system, you need approximately 26,000 salary, but for the care workers, it is reduced to 20,000. So there's a way to actually identify those we need in the care industry, for example, and putting them into a separate category so that there's a separate rules apply.
And what about the health surcharge that these people have to pay? Would you advise the government to get rid of it for health workers?
We have from the beginning actually said that to scrap the surcharge, but as it's not happening, what we're asking is that the employers like NHS Trust, Health Education England, the local NHS England teams should pay for their employees so that they're valued as their employers.
Right, so effectively it's got rid of and it's paid for by their employers at the time.
That's what we're asking for.
Okay,
yes.
Dr. Chandra Kanaganti, thank you very much. Let's turn to Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's Labour's Shadow Home Secretary and is on the line. Morning to you.
Good morning, Justin.
What do you make of what you just heard? Can you go along with all of that?
The point about the immigration health surcharge, absolutely yes, and I think that it is totally unfair on the one hand to be saying thank you to those foreign-born workers we have in our NHS and then charging them for actually using it. Now, the Home Secretary has actually waived it for those healthcare staff who've had their visas extended from October. She then promised to review it for other staff in the NHS. She apparently now isn't reviewing it, and I think that's the wrong thing to do. And I think it really does speak to whether we value what people have been doing to help us through this crisis or not.
And more widely, what changes would you like to see in the government's plans, or indeed what would your plans be in their position for bringing in people more widely in the health service, including those who would not normally be described as highly skilled and aren't highly paid?
Well, firstly, I don't think we should be rushing this. We are in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic when none of us can be absolutely sure what the circumstances and needs are going to be emerging from it. But what I think we do know is that what the government is proposing is not fair and it's not in the national interest. And that's because they are deeming people who are low-skilled to be unwelcome in this country. That isn't an acceptable way to proceed. We see the clap for carers on a Thursday evening. It is wrong to then say on a Monday that you are unskilled and that people with those skills are not welcome in this country. And that's why I'm asking the government to think again. We can't support an immigration bill today that is a threat to our health and social care sector.
So what should they do?
Well, in terms of what the government should do, they first of all need to look at why they need to bring this immigration bill forward at this particular moment, at the height of the crisis at all. That's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is they then need to look more broadly at an immigration system that has fairness at its heart, that has national interest at its heart, and actually values people properly. Because the real problem with what the government is doing is it seems to be saying that your salary reflects your contribution to society. And if this crisis has shown us one thing, it should show us that that is wrong. The very people that we have relied upon to get us through this, whether it's in the social care sector, whether it's in the wider retail sector, for example, refuse collectors, local government workers, all these workers would be deemed as low-skilled and unwelcome under the system the government is proposing, and that's why I'm asking them to think again.
Nick Thomas-Simmons, thank you very much.
It is now 3 minutes to 8, and it's time for the weather. Nick Miller.
Good morning. Warmer weather on the way for all of us for a time this week, around midweek, particularly with plenty of sunshine. But the week is starting and it will end with a chance of rain for some of us. Let's take a look around the UK for today. And for southwest England, southeast England, eastern England, the Midlands and South Wales. Here, we're not expecting any rain. We're expecting some warm, sunny spells today, just a bit of patchy cloud here and there. For North Wales and northwest England, this is where we do have more cloud around, and we are going to see some occasional, mostly light rain or drizzle. For northeast England, some clouds, some hazy sunny spells. When the cloud is thick enough, you may just see a little bit of patchy rain. For Northern Ireland, it'll be a mainly cloudy day. There will be some occasional rain around, more especially this afternoon into this evening. And in Scotland, for northern areas here, we are starting quite wet. It's a band of rain that's going to push northwards through the Northern Isles, but behind that, across the northern half of Scotland, we will see some sunny spells developing, but through much of the central belt and southern Scotland, it stays cloudy, and there'll be some further occasional rain. As for temperatures for Scotland, Northern Ireland, northwest England, North Wales, basically the areas seeing the cloud today, 14 to 17 degrees. The rest of England and Wales around 18 to 22, but as high as 24 degrees Celsius around the London area.
Nick, thanks. Here's Stuart McConey now to tell us something about something new starting this afternoon.
One thing that lockdown's proved is how much the British love a quiz. We've all been at it, but you may have found that your general knowledge rather depends on your generation. That's why Radio 4's new quiz puts the different generations to the test. How much do we know about one another's heroes, heroines and heritage? When someone says to you R&B, do you think Georgie Fame or Beyonce? And if I say The Avengers, do you think of Diana Rigg in a catsuit or Scarlett Johansson in a catsuit? Join me, Stuart McConey, for the quiz that spans the decades. My Generation on BBC Radio 4 this afternoon at 3.
In the next hour on this programme, will a vaccine really be available as soon as the autumn? We'll speak to one of the British scientists leading the search, the Culture Secretary, and whether the government can break the impasse over primary school reopenings and if offices never reopen or we miss them.
You're listening to Today on Radio 4, Nick Robinson and Justin Webb. It's 8 o'clock on Monday the 18th of May. The headlines this morning: crowd control measures are in place at some railway stations as train companies run more services but impose limits on how many people can board them. Labour says the government's draft legislation for a post-Brexit immigration system is an insult to NHS staff and care workers who've played a key role in the coronavirus outbreak. And bars, restaurants and hairdressers are reopening in Italy, and public church services will resume as well. The BBC News is read this morning by Chris Aldrich.
Efforts to get more commuters safely back to work by train are coming into force this morning. Security guards specialising in crowd control will be on duty at some bigger railway stations, and limits on passenger numbers are being implemented. The industry body, the Rail Delivery Group, says services will be increased to around 70% of the timetable before the coronavirus lockdown. People are still being advised to use public transport only if it is essential and they have no alternative. Our transport correspondent Tom Burridge reports from one of the UK's busiest stations.
This morning, staff often outnumber passengers here at London Euston. British Transport Police officers and security guards are here in case there are crowds. But so far, relatively small numbers of people have been arriving off services into London. One-way systems are now in place and entrance points could be temporarily closed to avoid overcrowding. Ticket barriers might also be blocked off if too many passengers enter a platform. Other people will have to wait for the next service. Train companies say they'll try and limit numbers on board, and some seats will be blocked off so passengers spread out. If a service gets too full early on, then it might not stop at other stations. And to avoid crowds in the future, I'm told it's possible that people might have to book a slot for when they can arrive at their station.
Sir Peter Hendy, chairman of Network Rail, told us that if the public and rail staff work together, the new arrangements could work.
I think people are being profoundly sensible, and providing that we do our best to look after them and they try as hard as they can to socially distance, I think we can make this as safe as we can.
Labour has urged the government to think again about its new immigration system, which MPs will debate today, describing it as a threat to the national interest. Under the new rules, people in jobs deemed to be low-skilled will be barred from working in the UK. They include occupations which have been on the front line during the coronavirus outbreak, such as care workers. Here's our assistant political editor, Norman Smith.
The immigration bill, designed to end freedom of movement and unskilled immigration, was always controversial. However, in the wake of the coronavirus epidemic, it's facing even stronger opposition because of its impact on some of those migrant workers who've been at the forefront of the crisis. Foreign care workers, in particular, would no longer be immediately eligible to come to the UK because they're not classified as skilled workers and would be unlikely to meet the required salary threshold. Critics have also highlighted the similar plight of refuse collectors, transport and retail workers. In a letter to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, the Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds, accuses ministers of rank hypocrisy for applauding these workers during the epidemic, but then refusing to make them welcome. The government, meanwhile, has said it wants more care homes to recruit British staff, but has said it will take into account qualifications obtained by foreign care workers, suggesting some flexibility.
Northern Ireland is taking some steps towards easing its lockdown, with garden centres and recycling facilities reopening. The Health Minister at Stormont has also announced that all care home staff and residents will be offered coronavirus tests. For the first time since Covid-19 engulfed the country 10 weeks ago, Italians will be able to visit shops and restaurants and get a haircut. Public church services are also resuming as the country's lockdown is further eased. From Milan, the capital of the badly affected Lombardy region, our correspondent Mark Lowen reports.
Italy was the first Western country to be hit by the tsunami of coronavirus. It was for long the global epicenter and the first to impose a national lockdown. 10 weeks and almost 32,000 deaths later, there's another wave of reopenings today with strict hygiene controls. Shops have glass screens at the till and must regularly disinfect changing rooms. Restaurants will only allow families to sit together. Hairdressers won't accept walk-in customers. Priests will wear gloves to deliver the communion wafer. The economic pain is deep. Italy's recession is forecast to be almost 10% this year, and debt will soar. But a country that felt in a hopeless spiral of deaths just a few weeks ago is now reopening and slowly recovering.
Official figures show Japan is now in recession for the first time since 2015. The world's third biggest economy shrank for the second quarter running in the first 3 months of this year. Ryanair has reported profits of around £900 million for the year to the end of March, an increase of 13%. But the airline has also warned of a difficult year ahead because of coronavirus and has already announced plans to shed 3,000 jobs. It now intends to restart large numbers of flights from July. Ryanair's chief executive, Michael O'Leary, denied he'd be encouraging passengers to flout the government's 14-day quarantine rules.
I don't think so. I mean, we don't have... I think what happens is that a 14-day, as it becomes, as the government puts more meat on the bones of an unimplementable, unmanageable and unpoliceable 14-day lockdown, people will simply ignore something that is so hopelessly defective.
A survey of more than 4,000 households suggests the lockdown is widening the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and those from wealthier families. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says better-off children are spending 30% more time each day studying. This could mean they'll have 7 days more learning behind them by the beginning of June than their less well-off counterparts. Here's our education editor, Branman Jeffries.
This research found in the highest income families, children are spending just under 6 hours a day on educational activities. The poorest families reported just 4.5 hours. When researchers looked at just primary-age children, the gap in time spent was slightly bigger than for older children. Whatever their income, more than half of parents said they were finding it hard to support their children learning at home. While there's been much debate about access to technology, this research says poorer children are also less likely to have a place to study. Fewer than half the parents said they would send their child back to school if they had a choice, but better-off parents were more willing.
The billionaire Sir Frederick Berkeley has released CCTV footage to the media which shows his nephew, Alistair, handling a bugging device at the Ritz Hotel in London. Sir Frederick and his daughter Amanda are suing his twin brother's 3 sons for alleged invasion of privacy. He says he's made the footage available in the public interest to stop the use of sophisticated surveillance devices intruding on people's lives. Here's our legal correspondent, Clive Coleman.
The footage from January shows Alistair Berkeley apparently inserting a plug adapter containing a listening device into a socket before looking into a CCTV camera installed by his uncle, who'd become suspicious. Over months, the device captured private and confidential conversations between Sir Frederick and his daughter Amanda. The Berkeley's businesses include the Telegraph Media Group and at the time also included the Ritz. Substantial parts are now owned by trusts, in which Sir David's 3 sons exercise a controlling interest as compared with Sir Frederick's daughter Amanda. Sir Frederick claims his nephews obtained knowledge of his conversations with Sidra Capital, which at the time had made an initial offer of some $1.3 billion for the Ritz, but that they sold it for half its market value. Ellerman, the holding company for the Berkeley's interests, has previously said that it was focused on obtaining best value for shareholders in negotiating the sale of the hotel.
A former cinema and dance hall in Cornwall that became the studio of the sculptor Dame Barbara Hepworth has been protected for the future by being given listed status. Dame Barbara used the building in St Ives, called the Palais de Danse, from 1961 until her death in 1975. Some of her most famous pieces were created there, as our arts correspondent Rebecca Jones reports.
Inside the workshop, you can still see the silhouette on the floor where Barbara Hepworth sketched out the shape of single form, the 21-foot-high bronze sculpture she created for the United Nations building in New York. It's also where she planned the winged figure for the John Lewis store on Oxford Street in London. Barbara Hepworth moved to St Ives in 1939, and she lived and worked in the seaside town for the rest of her life. She spoke to Radio 4 in 1968.
I often open my studio for people to come in, and it's a joy to me. Sometimes they will have their arms around a thing, and I know that they feel it.
As she became more successful, she needed extra space, so she bought the former cinema and dance hall opposite her home and turned it into a studio to create her large-scale pieces.
Rebecca Jones reporting.
Thank you, Chris. It's 8:10. If you've got that Monday morning feeling, that will we ever get our normal lives back feeling, you may well be craving some good news. The front page of your morning paper may seem to offer it. Half of Britons could get jab in months, says the Mail's front page. It, like many papers, reports the announcement at yesterday's Downing Street news conference. The ministers had helped to broker a deal for AstraZeneca to produce up to 30 million doses of a vaccine by the autumn. We'll discuss how realistic that timetable is in a moment. First, though, another good news story from yesterday's Sunday Times, the story of the 30 85-year-old woman who spent a staggering 58 days on a ventilator and is now speaking for the first time. Dr. Sanjay Gupta is the lead consultant of critical care at Southampton General Hospital, who looked after her. Morning to you, Dr. Gupta. It must have been an incredibly exciting moment when she spoke.
Morning, Nick. Yes, I mean, she's been with us nearly for 2 months, and she's clearly come a very, very long way. And one of the key things for her was when we put the tracheostomy tube in, which is part of our weaning process, and this happened around 3 weeks into her stay. And
just
that
to
really
explain,
is...
let her breathe through a tube through her neck rather than push down the throat through the mouth.
Exactly, and that is tolerated much better by patients, so that means that we don't have to sedate them so deeply. And that allowed us to wake her up. Really, and through this tracheostomy tube, we were able to put a speaking valve in a few days later, which is what allowed her to speak to us. But prior to that, the only way she could communicate was through hand gestures or using a board, etc. But even that was actually very difficult, because after about 3-4 weeks being on a ventilator, the body deconditioned so much that all her muscles had become very weakened. So even sitting on the edge of the bed became a real trial.
The real excitement of this, more generally, is that there were beginning to be suggestions that being placed onto a ventilator was almost a death sentence, because it was claimed that so many people on ventilation never recovered.
I think yes. I mean, there is varying data from around the world that and mortality figures are quoted as high as 90% in some places. But she's definitely one of our good news stories, in the sense that and it's a testimony to the hard work of the ICU nurses and the rehab team that we've got her through. She's still got a long way to go, but clearly I think she's got a good chance of pulling through this. In some ways, I mean, the 60 days, it sounds like a long time, but it's not uncommon for patients to have a prolonged period on intensive care. And I think this is new, because we haven't come across this in COVID patients before. So it's definitely...
I was just going to end by saying congratulations to you and to the team, and many, many best wishes to her as she embarks on what's sure to be a long recovery. Let's turn now to Professor Robin Shattuck, who's head of mucosal infection and immunity at Imperial College London. He's leading a team at Imperial developing a vaccine for Covid-19 and chairs the board of directors at the place where all those vaccine doses are going to be manufactured, a new innovation centre in Harwell, Oxfordshire. Morning to you, Professor Shattuck.
Good morning.
Just to be clear, there's more than one vaccine being searched for, not just globally, but here in the UK. Your team doing something rather different from the Oxford University team.
Yes, so in the UK we have 2 front-running candidates that are trying to be developed as fast as possible, and there are other vaccine candidates within the UK at a much earlier stage. And globally we're aware there's over 100 different types of vaccines that are at different stages of the developmental process.
But this new centre that you're chairing, the board of directors, though in Oxford, it is available for all these candidate vaccines, is it?
Yes, so it was actually planned before the current pandemic, and what's happened now is the government has accelerated and provided new funding to bring it on stream much faster, and it's really agnostic as to what it's going to make. It will make the vaccines that are needed. So if one of the UK vaccines works well, it'll start churning that out, but alternatively, if a different vaccine looks better, it will be positioned to make that as well.
Now, let's turn then to that timetable, because the news that up to 30 million doses could be made by AstraZeneca this autumn suggests that we really are on the brink of getting this vaccine. Is that overstating overstating the optimism and understating the barriers in the way?
So I think we need to distinguish 2 different things. One of the hurdles is making vaccine doses, and obviously AstraZeneca can do that, and that's a good thing. But that's very different to having the data that proves that the vaccine actually works. And we need to have those data to show that it's ready and appropriate to roll out. It may take quite some time to get that data. It's a numbers game. And in fact, as we're better at reducing the number of infections in the UK, it gets much harder to test whether vaccine works or not. And there are no certainties, no guarantees in developing any of these candidates. So I think it's important not to have a false expectation that it's just around the corner. It may be longer than any of us would want to think.
Could it be as long as the timetable put on it by Dr. Anthony Fauci, the man who's often seen at Donald Trump's side, who said in the United States that he expected the search for a vaccine to take at least a year, possibly 18 months?
Again, I think we need to keep context here. Obviously, there could be some success. We could see things working earlier if we get the numbers, and the kind of AstraZeneca approach is preparing for that success. But it's probably very likely that we won't really get the evidence until into early next year. And then there's a difference between a solution in the UK that could be rolled out and a global solution. A global solution is likely to take much longer just because of the sheer operational effort to make billions of doses and make them available worldwide.
That raises the question that is explored in a number of editorials in today's newspaper: who gets it and who gets it first? Now, some newspapers are saying, well, if Oxford's developing it, if your team at Imperial are developing it, if it is being made here by AstraZeneca and developed at Harwell, well, then Britain will get it first. Others say, Gordon Brown the other day, there needs to be a global effort to make sure that everybody gets it pretty much at the same time. What's your view?
Well, I think we need both. There is some kind of concerning noises around the globe about rich countries being able to get vaccines earlier, and I think it's, due precedent on all of them to make sure if they get there, they make them available. But inevitably, if you make a vaccine locally, it's easy to get those doses rolled out locally quicker than providing a global solution. So we need both. We need those countries that develop the vaccines to be looking to global provision. I think the UK is doing that, but obviously that global piece will inevitably take longer.
So the way to achieve both, as it were, is that the doses manufactured here may start off for use in Britain, but it may be licensed, if there's a success, for use all over the world.
That's absolutely the case, and I think any vaccine that's shown to be really effective, the world community donors will get behind to ensure that there is global access, that they are manufactured at affordable costs. But it will take time to do that scale-up piece.
A last question, and you may think slightly unfair to a scientist, but yes, you've well set out the obstacles, the uncertainties, crudely the fact we simply don't know. What's your gut telling you, though, Professor Shatter, when you turn to your family or over a drink and say, we'll see the back of this disease by?
Well, I think we have a very high chance of seeing a number of vaccines that work because we know a lot about this target, and I think there's good scientific rationale to say it's not such a hard target as others. My gut feeling is that we'll start to see a number of candidates coming through with good evidence early towards next year, possibly something this year, but they won't be readily available for wide-scale use into the beginning of next year as the kind of most optimistic estimation.
Professor Robin Shatter, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
19 minutes past 8. There is a further issue to be discussed in this half hour of science on the programme. Do we need to widen our view of what the symptoms of COVID actually are? And if we concentrate on the R number, the reproduction rate, and talk about it regionally, as we were on the programme on Friday, does that actually lead us to greater enlightenment and wiser decisions or not? Tim Spector is on the line, who's Professor of Genetic Epidemiology at King's College London, the lead investigator of the COVID Symptom Study app. Morning to you.
Morning.
And if we could just start with the R number stuff, because it's so much in people's thoughts at the moment. The government seems to be telling us that it's going to be basing its view of what should happen next on the R numbers. How reliable do you think the R is, the average for the whole country, and is there a regional variation that is useful to look at?
Well, we have become a bit obsessed with the R number, and I think it's often because it's easy for politicians and people talking to the public to come up with a simple overview. But it's really just the rate at which we're seeing new infections. And R values need a number of assumptions in order to estimate them. You can't just easily go and count people and get it. And so at the moment, we're relying on rather poor data to get R values. So most of the ones that we've been hearing about have been based on, for example, number of hospital admissions, or more recently, there was this Cambridge MRC study that did it based on number of deaths. And that came up with an overview of the country, which generally they're between 0.5 and 1. And then this recent one gave us a breakdown by regions. And any epidemiologist will tell you that there are big errors around these margins because of all the assumptions you need to make, which we don't know. We're guessing a lot of these, particularly when you're not counting actual cases in the community. You're just looking at what happened 4 weeks down the line and trying to work backwards to those regions. Yes. So I think it's really bad for people to obsess about, is my region higher than your region, because A, that data is now old, and B, the errors around that based on just a few people are actually massive.
But
so
is there a better basis, though, for the government to take its decisions?
Well, I think that, what the government, and I'm sure this is what they're doing when I speak to the government epidemiologists, they are looking at all the data and all the R value estimates, some of which are public, some of which are not. And so that's really important, because you can get the R values from deaths, you can get it from hospital admissions, but there's now new data from populations. And so, as well as our symptom tracking app, which is the largest source of this data now, with about 1.5 million people logging every day, telling us what's going on and are we seeing changes. You can work out estimates of R from that, but actually what you want to see is, well, are you seeing new cases every day? And the only other way of doing that is the NHS digital line as well, which reassuringly is telling us that we're not seeing big changes over the last 2 weeks. Whether you look at those people in from our regular 1.5 million that are having swab tests, or you're seeing, you're looking at the antibody studies that are coming out, it's fairly flat at the moment. So that's generally reassuring. We're not seeing any, and we don't see changes between regions. So I think it's all about getting more data from lots of sources and then looking at that properly.
But does that tell us anything about the impact of reducing the lockdown?
It tells us that we've got at least 100,000 cases at the moment of people who are infected, and this is from our data, although the NHS would underestimate that because they're not counting all the symptoms. But
I'll get to that in a second, if we may.
But the key is there's still people out there who can infect others, and that means we do have to be very vigilant. Even if it's flat, it doesn't mean it's stopped, and that's probably coming from hospitals and care homes. And that's where we do need to be very vigilant.
Right, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Before we get to the symptom issue, which is fascinating in itself, that you think at the moment the driver of it is in hospitals and care homes. It is not on the street, in the park, in workplaces?
There's no evidence from our data that's true, because we've seen in our populations, which is our study is mainly people aged 18 to 80, and who aren't in care homes, and those rates were steadily falling when death rates were not falling at the same rate. So that's why we're seeing this mismatch. Yeah. That the population is going down. There is a small residual amount in there, but it hasn't disappeared completely. But most of it, I think, is around the care homes and hospitals.
To the wider point, and my goodness, you've been making it for some weeks now, and very forcefully, but it still hasn't quite had an impact, has it, in government thinking? And this is about the symptoms, because to put it bluntly, is it fair to say you just think we're not testing for enough symptoms?
That's correct. So on our app, which I encourage all the listeners who haven't already signed up, and I think a lot of them have, to join, we list about 14 symptoms which we know are related to having a positive swab test. And these are not being picked up by the NHS. And 17 other countries, the WHO, the EU, even the CDC in America, weeks ago, have actually altered their list of symptoms that they know are related to being infectious. And so at the moment, people are being told to go back to work if they're a care worker and they've got something like loss of smell or taste or severe muscle pains or fatigue, things that we know and we've shown are related to being swab positive. This country is missing them all, and I underestimate the cases, but also putting people at risk and continuing the epidemic. So we really do need to tell Public Health England to get in line with the rest of the world and, make people more aware. There's no point telling people to be alert if they don't know the symptoms.
I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. You're saying that there are, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have COVID, but with no way of picking it up.
Absolutely, because at the moment they're not really being offered tests, and they're being told not to self-isolate if they don't have the fever and the cough. And it's probably around half of the people in the population who are in that situation. All the data.
What kind of numbers would that be?
We're probably missing at the moment between 50 and 70,000 people out there who are infected.
And could spread it to others, obviously, or will.
Yes, we know that their swab tests will be positive. So, they're in the same situation as people with coughs and things. So I think someone has got urgently asked this question of why we're the only country in these crises that isn't really widening our group of symptoms and get on with it and do something.
Professor Tim Spector of King's College London, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Coming up to 27 minutes past 8, it's time for the sports news. Rob.
Hello, Nick. Yes, so how, I wonder, did Germany's resumption of elite-level football go with its Bundesliga programme over the weekend? One more match to come tonight, Werder Bremen against Bayer Leverkusen, which, like the other 8, will be played behind closed doors with 5, not 3 substitutes allowed. And whilst the players have been regularly clattering into each other on the pitch, not even gentle handshaking is allowed. I've been getting the impressions of former German international and Liverpool star Dietmar Hamann.
It really couldn't have gone any better. There were no incidents on the pitch. Yeah, the players behaved impeccably. There was one small incident where the celebrations of the Hertha Berlin players when they scored the second and the third goal to win the match in Hoffenheim were a bit over the top. But apart
that was
from
the Chelsea striker Salomon Kalou, wasn't it? He was suspended by Hertha Berlin.
He was, yeah, he was. It was really the only talking point. There were no fans at the ground. It was a very good first step.
A recent poll conducted by the German broadcaster ARD revealed that 56% of the public were against the resumption of the Bundesliga. Do you think that the objections raised there will have reduced after this weekend?
Yeah, well, I hope so. A lot of these people, their opinion is that football is just starting too early. But the matter of fact is that what we know now of the virus, we've got to contain it, and the situation in football in Germany won't be any different in 2 weeks or 6 months' time. And it's simply not an option to not play for the next 6 to 12 months till maybe we found a vaccine. In Germany, people love their football, they love the Bundesliga, they want to see football games. Obviously, it's not ideal because the fans make football. It's not possible to play football without fans, but at the moment, there's simply no other options. A lot of people had a welcome distraction, and it's only a small step. The officials, the players, they still have to obey to the rules now for the next few weeks, but it was a very good first step in the right direction.
How much do you think does the lack of atmosphere in the stadiums matter if you're watching the game on television?
We've got a new service where there's an option to press a button. We had it yesterday with Sky, where you have the noise as if there were 20, 40 or 60,000 in the stadium, and I think it was very well received.
Does it work?
It did work, yeah, it did work. The people loved it. At the same time, you still have the option to watch it without the fan noise. Some people want to watch it like this because you hear the players talk, you hear the managers talk.
So a game, Dietmar, without crowd atmosphere, but some TV viewers, I suppose, may be glad to have noted the absence, for example, of hysterical goal celebrations.
Yeah, well, that's right. And obviously the players have been advised to not celebrate goals over the top, as sometimes happen. But I think it also shows that when there's no fans, I'm not sure whether there's a point to celebrate exuberantly, because when you do score a goal with the fans in the stadium, you celebrate them with the fans. I think it was probably the easiest thing for the players to have these low-key celebrations yesterday because there were simply no fans there.
Dietmar, you've made a number of interesting points so far. Officials and players from England's Premier League will doubtless have been watching this weekend's football in Germany with enormous interest. What lessons do you think can they take from these games as they try to move towards the resumption of the Premier League?
Well, I think it's if you want to restart the Premier League, it's got to go hand in hand with the politics. And obviously the DFL, the equivalent of the Premier League in Germany, puts together a concept which politicians approve. I think they can learn a lot from the Bundesliga, from the DFL, not only the European leagues, also the professional American leagues, whether it's football or baseball, basketball. I think they all watched with interest over the last few days and weeks what's happening here.
I've got to ask you one final question, and that is, do you think that Liverpool, as a former player, you'll clearly have a view, do you think that Liverpool should be awarded the title of the Premier League for the first time, whether or not the season is finished?
I think it'll be tough, because I think everybody agrees that they deserve the title, and if there will be games played and the season is finished, they will win the title. But to simply award Liverpool the title, I'm not sure whether that would be in the best interest of the sport. Having said that, I think everybody agrees they do deserve it.
Dima Haman, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
One other line, and professional golf's first outing since the lockdown provided a victory for Rory McIlroy. He and partner Dustin Johnson beat Ricky Fowler and Matthew Wolff in a match in Florida that raised about $4 million for various healthcare charities in the USA. Coronavirus protocols were observed. Only the match referee touched the flagstick, and the players even carried their own bags. Welcome to my world.
Thank you very much, Rob. Start the Week is in half an hour, and Andrew Marr can tell us more.
Hello. Well, it hasn't received a lot of notice from politicians, but coronavirus has divided the biggest cities, which have been very hard hit, from most of the rest of the country, the towns and villages of provincial Britain. They've had fewer cases, many fewer deaths, but they've had to pay just as high an economic and social price. It comes on top of the Brexit revolt by the left-behind provinces, where we're told the silent majority lives. I'm going to be looking at why the word provincial now always seems to come with a sneer attached to it, as I talk to Professor Ruth Livesey, an expert in Victorian culture when Britain gloried in the provinces, and the American master of small-town fiction, Richard Ford. Start the week, Glories in the Provincial, at 9.
Talking of glories, let's look at the weather. Dry across the south with the best of the sunshine in that part of the country. There'll be showers in northern and western parts of Britain during the day, but the early rain in northern Scotland will clear.
You're listening to Today on Radio 4, Nick Robinson and Justin Webb. It's 28 minutes to 9, and Chris Aldridge has the news.
Security guards specialising in crowd control are on duty at some railway stations as part of plans to ensure social distancing as more commuters start travelling into work again. The industry body, the Rail Delivery Group, says services will be increased to around 70% of the timetable before the coronavirus lockdown, but trains will be only 10% full. Labour has urged the government to think again about its post-Brexit immigration system, which MPs will debate today, describing it as a threat to the national interest because of the potential impact on the NHS and care sector. Ministers say the new rules will end freedom of movement and make it easier to attract talented people to the UK. Italy has continued easing its lockdown. People can now visit shops, restaurants and hairdressers, though with tight controls. Public church services are also resuming. Official figures show Japan is now in recession for the first time since 2015. The world's third biggest economy shrank for the second quarter running in the first 3 months of this year. Ryanair has reported profits of around £900 million for last year, but has warned of a difficult year ahead. It's hoping to restart many flights in July despite the government's quarantine rules, which the airline's chief executive, Michael O'Leary, described on this programme as idiotic.
It is just coming up to 25 to 9. Well, we did indeed hear the passionate view of the Ryanair boss that the government's proposed quarantine plans for incoming air passengers are idiotic. He said they wouldn't work. We've also been hearing this morning about the trains running more frequently, and that so far that is going well. Let's talk about that and other matters to Oliver Dowden, who's Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and is on the line. Morning to you.
Good morning.
Can we start with Michael O'Leary? You probably didn't hear him. He was on earlier. He was very, very passionate, even for him, actually. He said the quarantine plans that we're going to hear more about, I think, later on in the week, are simply not going to work. Is the government open to changing them?
Well, I'm afraid, as you say, I didn't hear what he said, but the idea of the quarantine rules is that as we start to get the numbers of COVID under control in this country, we want to ensure that we don't then start to import cases again from overseas. That's why we're having these quarantine rules. But we are looking at the detail of it in terms of what exemptions might be allowed. For example, we have said freight drivers would be exempt in order to keep the flow of traffic going across the border. So we're working out those final details.
Yes, and his point was then that if you do allow some people in, then the whole thing is pretty pointless.
Well, I don't think that's the case. There'll be a significant reduction in numbers. We look at very limited exemptions, so it would be significantly reducing people coming in from overseas.
And what would happen to someone who ignored it?
Well, we would look at the relevant enforcement mechanisms, just as we have done with other measures. So, for example, the measures that we took when we introduced the so-called lockdown, those were underpinned by regulations which had consequences in law, and I'm sure we'd do the same thing in response.
So it would be enforced by the police. If you were seen leaving your house within that 14-day period, you would be prosecuted.
Well, the regulations of the company will set out the exact enforcement mechanisms, but clearly you would need enforcement mechanisms.
But there would be enforcement, because he said we're never going to know. He said you've not got enough police to enforce it anyway. But you're saying no, absolutely. Your intention is that this would be enforced by law.
Well, the whole experience we've actually had during the lockdown is very high levels of public compliance with it. People have been reasonable about all of this, and throughout this whole crisis, for me, the common sense of British people has shone through, and a straightforward approach to obeying the rules, and I'm sure that would pertain in respect to quarantine as well.
A wider transport issue. We've got people back on trains this morning. Seems to be going pretty well, and we've heard a couple of times from the big stations in London, and we're getting messages from around the country as well, where obviously train use is slightly reduced, is slightly less anyway. Longer term, I mean, taking London as the example, you've got a congestion charge reimposed today, in other words, dissuading people from driving, but you're also, I think, telling them not to go on public transport if they can avoid it. Is that not a mixed message?
Well, the number one message throughout all of this remains work from home if you possibly can. And I think you've probably seen with certainly the London commuter traffic that most people are adhering to that. And as Digital and Culture Minister, I see firsthand, as I'm sure all of your listeners do, the huge transformations we've seen in how we work by, for example, using FaceTime and Zoom and all these other mechanisms. So that is helping enormously. We are saying that if you can't work from home, then you should go to work and look at other means of transport. It's not just cars, it's also looking at increased cycling. That's certainly something that can help us with some of the wider challenges.
But I mean, you think of London and the commuting. I mean, concentrating on London for just a second, because it is, of course, an awful lot of people. If you think of the wider commute that is not possible to do cycling, and you've got the charge on people coming into London now, does that not send out the message, well, you better be back on the train?
Well, we have told people to try and avoid public transport if they can, in respect to the
so why not make it easier for them to drive?
Well, in respect to the congestion charge, clearly that is a matter for the Mayor of London, but we have given additional resources to the Mayor of London in relation to the...
Is it true or not, though, that the quid pro quo for those additional resources to keep TfL going was that he would have to put up the congestion charge and put it back on? Is that something that comes from government, or is that just him acting off his own bat?
Well, there's clearly a big problem with the finances of TfL. That's why we have given this bailout to the Mayor, and also why he's had to impose the congestion charge to help get back a grip.
Right, so you accept it did have to go back on?
Well, because of the situation that we had with the finances of TfL.
But I suppose that then brings me back to this issue that for people commuting long distances where they can't cycle or walk or whatever, what are they to do? You don't want them on the trains, but apparently you don't want them to drive either.
Well, people should look at a variety of options for getting. I mean, you talk about...
There aren't any others, though.
Just the vast majority of people who are driving to work are not driving into central London. In respect to people that are driving into central London, there's always been a congestion charge, and that congestion charge remains. We're also investing in enhanced cycling capacity, and there is the train for people for whom none of those options work.
Another issue we were discussing earlier on the programme, the immigration bill coming up for its second reading in the Commons today. From Labour, a call for the surcharge, the health surcharge that incoming migrants have to pay, to be paid for them by the various health authorities if they work in the health sector. Is that something that the government is ruling out?
Well, we're not ruling anything out. Of course, we keep all policy under review. I would hope, though, that Labour would have welcomed the immigration bill. We go back to the referendum. The central issue there was about taking back control. Immigration was an important part of this. This means that finally we determine exactly who comes into this country, and we can attract the brightest and the best from around the world, not just from confining it to within Europe. We won't discriminate people outside of Europe, and I think that will ensure that we get the very best people into this country, and I think that's something to be welcomed.
Of course, some of those very best people are the people who are helping us in our care homes at the moment, and often at enormous cost to themselves. Do we still want foreign people to come into this country to work in that sector?
Well, we want the people that we need for the health service and for the country at large. And we'll have the opportunity to set our own rules to ensure that we get the people that we need. In respect to the wider NHS, that's why we've introduced the NHS visa, which has a fast track application process and reduced fees. If we need other skills, then of course we will now have the flexibility because we're able to determine our own rules.
But we will need them, won't we?
Well, there's an awful lot of capacity within the United Kingdom for people to work in care homes. But of course, the whole point of this new regime is that we're able to determine where the need is and adjust the rules to suit that.
Right. Oliver Dowden, thank you very much for talking to us this morning.
It is 18 minutes to 9. Does the virus spread in schools? Answering that question holds the key to whether teachers and parents will be happy to see some children return to the classroom at the beginning of next month. It's the subject of inquiry right around the world as scientists seek to learn from the experience of others. One study in Australia has caught the eye of government advisers. It's the front page splash in which is urging teacher unions to stop blocking a return to work. Let's talk now to the director of Australia's National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance, Christine McCartney, who has been carrying out this research. She's a professor at the University of Sydney. Morning to you. Morning British time, at least.
Good evening, Australian time, Nick.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. What did you do in the study and what did you find?
So here in the state of New South Wales, we have about 1.8 million children under the age of 18 and almost 3,000 schools. So we examined what was happening in schools during the epidemic from the beginning of March through to mid-April. And across that 6-week period, we had 15 schools where either a teacher or a student attended while they were infectious with COVID-19. So we then set about, with our public health authorities here, closely monitoring all of their close contacts from the school environment, again, both teachers and student contacts, of which there were almost 900, and doing extra tests on them while they were in isolation and following up with some blood tests at the end of a month to determine how many were secondarily infected.
And how many were? So
altogether there were only 2 that became secondarily infected in these 15 schools. So across which, and there were no other cases across the sort of 1.8 million children. So in our context, at the time when the epidemic was on the incline, albeit only reaching about 250 cases across the state per day, we saw a very low rate of transmission within our schools.
So, on the one hand, a low rate of transmission. On the other, quite a low rate of cases that you're studying, isn't it? More research needed.
Well, certainly more research needed. And what we posted was, in fact, just a preliminary report. So we are still doing this research not only across schools, but also across childcare centres. And we're working in term 2. I mean, it is very important to note that Australia's epidemic has been different to many other parts of the world. We closed our borders down very quickly, and that was, I think, particularly effective for us. So in total in Australia, we've only had a little over 6,000 cases, and our curve has really gone down to just a handful of cases per day now. So it has been in that context that we've been able to keep schools open by and large, and that at the moment we are seeing, in a very staggered and careful way, students returning to face-to-face learning in the school environment.
As I mentioned, this is front page news in a national newspaper, The Telegraph, influential amongst Conservative MPs and ministers. Would you feel comfortable if your survey was being used to say to teacher unions, there we are, told you so, it is safe for kids to go back to school?
Look, I think it's important to take our study in the context in which it was done. I think it's really a complex decision once you are talking about returning, to the workplace, returning to school, opening up transportation, as I think I just heard you discussing. All of these things need to be really carefully considered, taking into account of the epidemiology, where your cases are, etc., etc. And so no one single piece of information can, certainly from another country, can provide the answer to the UK or anywhere else. But I think it is consistent, though, with what we do know about children being less affected by the disease.
I was going to say nevertheless, but very interesting, and we're grateful for you coming on, taking the time in your evening to come and talk to us. Christine McCartney, Professor McCartney, thank you.
14 minutes to 9. CCTV footage has been released to the media showing Alistair Barclay, who is the nephew of the billionaire Sir Frederick Barclay, apparently handling a bugging device at the Ritz Hotel in London. Sir Frederick claims that the surveillance gave his nephews a commercial advantage over him, and that they sold the Ritz Hotel for half of its market value. The footage has been released amid a very bitter legal battle between the families of the billionaire Barclay brothers. Clive Coleman's our legal correspondent. And what do we know? Have you watched the video? What does it actually show?
I have watched it. It shows Alistair Barclay, he's the son of Sir David Barclay, on the 13th of January inserting a plug adapter, which it's claimed contains the listening device, into a socket, and then looking into a CCTV camera installed by his uncle, who'd become suspicious, but installed under the hotel's authority. And over months, the device captured conversations between that uncle, Sir Frederick Barclay, and Sir Frederick's daughter, Amanda. Now, the footage has been released by Sir Frederick, he says, in the public interest.
Yeah, but all of it is, of course, involved in this legal case. Give us a sense of what the wider legal case is about.
Well, Justin, one of the barristers in the case quoted Tolstoy's line, "Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way," and that gives you a flavour. 85-year-old Sir Frederick Barclay, he's the elder twin by 10 minutes, and his daughter Amanda are suing his brother, Sir David Barclay's sons, Alistair, Aidan and Howard, Aidan's son Andrew, and another man for alleged invasion of privacy, breach of confidence and data protection laws. Now, the Barclays' businesses include the Telegraph Media Group, and included at the time of the bugging, the Ritz in London. Substantial parts of the brothers' empire are now owned by trusts in which their children are both trustees and beneficiaries. And that means that Sir David's three sons exercise a controlling interest as compared with Sir Frederick's daughter Amanda. Now, at a hearing at the High Court on the 6th of May, explosive allegations about commercial espionage on a vast scale were made in court documents lodged by Sir Frederick and Amanda. And it's claimed that the bug captured more than 1,000 separate conversations amounting to some 94 hours of recordings, and that a separate Wi-Fi bug was supplied by the private investigation firm Quest Global. Its chairman is former Met Police Commissioner Lord Stevens, and that it invoiced for 405 hours of listening to transcribing recordings and so forth.
And of course, the really explosive thing right at the heart of the whole thing is this allegation that the Ritz was sold for half of what it should have been sold for.
Well, yes, Sir Frederick claims his nephews obtained knowledge of his conversations with Sidra Capital, which at the time had made an initial offer of some £1.3 billion for the acquisition of the Ritz. His document says, despite this, the defendants sold the Ritz Hotel to another buyer from Qatar at a price that appears to be half the market value. One is left to speculate why. And the hotel was sold by Sir David's side of the family in March to the Qatari businessman Abdul Hadi Mana al-Hajri. And Sir Frederick had threatened legal action if the Ritz was sold for less than £1 billion. Now,
Shortly after Alistair Barkley, he's a former racing car driver, was caught on film handling the bugging device, Amanda was removed as a director of the Ritz, and on the same day, two of Sir David's other sons, Aidan and Howard, were made directors. Now, Element Holdings, the holding company for the Barclays interests, has previously said that it was focused on obtaining the best value for its shareholders in relation to the sale of the Ritz. Heather Rogers QC for the defendants told the High Court that Sir Frederick and Amanda's claims had been put in an eye-catching and emotive way, and it was unfortunate that they're being canvassed in public rather than resolved in the family. And at a previous hearing...